She was the janitor no one noticed until the day a smug teacher handed her a piece of chalk as a joke, and she solved an unsolvable calculus problem in front of the entire class. What happened next shook the entire school, and it'll shake you too. It was supposed to be just another Friday. The air inside Rosewood Academy was as polished as its marble floors, cold pristine, perfect students, in designer sneakers, shuffled through the hallways clutching AP textbooks, murmuring about Ivy League acceptances and debate finals. Teachers stood at classroom doors like gatekeepers of brilliance, nodding to students they thought worthy, bypassing others as if they were invisible. And beneath all of that noise and privilege, a woman moved silent, unseen. Her name was Clara Daniels. Most people didn't know her name. They called her Miss, or more often didn't call her anything at all. She wore a navy blue janitor uniform that was always neat, shoes that never squeaked, and gloves that smelled faintly of bleach. Every morning, Clara pushed her supply cart down the same long hallways, wiping away fingerprints and chalk dust clearing spaces for other people to shine. But that day, everything shattered. That day, the woman everyone ignored stood in front of a room full of elite students, was handed a piece of chalk by a sarcastic teacher, and was dared to do the impossible. That day, Clara Daniels, the invisible janitor, reached for the board and solved a calculus problem so complex that even the top students couldn't touch it. And when she turned around and spoke just one sentence, the air in the room changed forever. No one saw it coming, especially not the man who tried to humiliate her. And you're going to want to stay with me through the very last second of this story, because what happens next doesn't just flip a classroom upside down. It flips everything you think you know about intelligence, race, class, and dignity. If you think you've heard every inspiring story before, you haven't heard this one. Before we dive in, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so we can keep sharing powerful stories. Like this one, your support gives this channel the strength to keep telling voices that have been silenced for too long. Now let me take you back to the moment the world started looking at Clara Daniels a little differently. Charleston, South Carolina, a city that wore its history like a scar wrapped in silk. Tourists walked its cobblestone streets with cameras and smiles snapping photos of charming homes and horse-drawn carriages. But beneath the soft aesthetic, there were truths no travel brochure ever mentioned. Rosewood Academy was one of those truths. Known as one of the most academically prestigious private high schools in the region, Rosewood was where the children of Charleston's elite went to prepare for futures already paved in gold. Inside, everything gleamed. Classrooms lined with mahogany state-of-the-art labs, teachers with PhDs. But what didn't shine was how the school treated those who cleaned it. Clara had been working at Rosewood for almost 20 years. She was the first to arrive in the morning, the last to leave at night. She never complained. She never spoke unless spoken to. And in all those years, no one ever asked her a single thing beyond, "Can you clean this up?" She didn't mind the silence. She had learned to live within it because silence was safer than the truth. Because once Clara Daniels had been something else entirely. Once she was a prodigy. She was 19 when she first stepped onto the campus of Princeton University, a math student on a full scholarship. She had grown up in the poorest corner of Charleston, raised by a veteran father and a mother who worked two jobs. Her childhood was filled with numbers. She didn't play with dolls, she played with equations. Professors at Princeton were stunned. Clara solved problems in minutes that others struggled with for hours. But brilliance alone was never enough. Because brilliance, when paired with black skin, poor clothes, and a southern drawl, made people uncomfortable. Other students ignored her. Professors questioned her work subtly, quietly. One day, someone wrote, "You don't belong here," on her dorm door, and then life knocked again. Her father was injured in a shipping yard accident. There was no insurance, no way her mother could cover bills and take care of her siblings, so Clara left school quietly, without ceremony. She returned to Charleston. She took a job. Any job. Eventually, she landed at Rosewood, where her story might have stayed buried forever. Until the day Mr. Elijah Burke decided to make a joke out of her. Mr. Burke was Rosewood's golden boy. Young, tall, confident, always dressed in clean-cut suits and pressed shirts. His lessons were sharp. His comments are even sharper. He was known for his intellect and his ego, the kind of man who thrived off being the smartest person in every room. But there was something else beneath the surface, a subtle coldness toward students of color, a polite dismissal toward those who didn't come from money. He tolerated excellence, but only if it came wrapped in the right skin and surname. That morning he was teaching his honors calculus class. On the board was a monster of an equation complex, multi-layered, designed to push the best students to their limits. Even Jasmine Patel, the class star, was stumped. That's when Clara entered, broom in hand, quiet, unnoticed until he noticed her. She was just there to sweep. But Burke, perhaps feeling theatrical, perhaps just wanting to impress the room, turned toward her and said, "Miss Daniels, you've been eavesdropping for weeks. Think you can solve this?" Laughter erupted. One student whispered, "She probably thinks calculus is a cleaning product." Clara froze, her fingers tightened around the broom. Her face betrayed nothing, but inside her, something cracked open. Burke wasn't serious. He expected her to shake her head, mumble, and walk away. But that's not what Clara did. She walked to the front of the class, slowly, deliberately. She picked up a piece of chalk, and for a second the room was silent enough to hear hearts beating. Then Clara looked at the board. She didn't flinch. She didn't ask a single question. She didn't hesitate. She just started writing, step by step, line by line, not just solving, but teaching. Her handwriting was clean, precise. Her logic was unshakable. Every part of the problem was dismantled like clockwork. One student's eyes widened. Another leaned forward. A minute passed, then another. And finally she reached the end. She set the chalk down, turned toward Burke, and said in a voice clear and even, "This is the answer you were looking for." The class didn't clap. They couldn't. They were too stunned, too disoriented by what they had just witnessed. The janitor had just done something none of them could. Mr. Burke stood frozen, his usual smirk replaced by something else, something unfamiliar, humility. Clara didn't wait for his reaction. She turned, picked up her broom, and walked out, leaving only silence behind her. But in her wake, a question hung in the air. Who is she? And over the next few days, Rosewood Academy would begin to ask that question again and again. The walls that had kept brilliance in one place and labor in another began to tremble, because Clara Daniels, the woman no one ever noticed, had just made herself impossible to ignore. And what happened next? Well, that's where everything really begins. But first, if Clara's story already has you speechless, if you want to know what she sacrificed, what she lost, and what she's about to change forever, then don't forget to subscribe. This channel is dedicated to giving voice to the unheard, and your support helps bring these hidden stories to life. And now, a quick challenge for you. Question time: Clara Daniels once attended which prestigious university before life pulled her away? A Harvard University, B Princeton University. Drop your answer A or B in the comments below. Let's see how closely you're following this incredible story. After that unforgettable day in Mr. Burke's classroom, when Clara Daniels shattered every expectation by solving the impossible, the world inside Rosewood Academy began to tilt ever so slightly. It wasn't an earthquake. No walls fell. No announcements were made. But a quiet shift had begun, something deeper than whispers and wider than hallway glances. The students who once breezed past her like she was furniture now looked up when she passed. Some nodded, a few even smiled, and others simply stared, still processing what they had seen but never expected. But while the school slowly began to awaken to Clara's presence, Clara herself was retreating inward, not because she was afraid, not because she regretted her actions, but because for the first time in decades she had touched a part of herself she had long ago buried, and touching it again had reopened memories she had tried hard not to feel, memories that still hurt. That evening, Clara sat at her small kitchen table, a chipped ceramic mug warming her palms. The apartment was quiet, the only sound the hum of the old refrigerator and the occasional creak of pipes that had seen better days. In the soft glow of the kitchen light, Clara was no longer the janitor from Rosewood. She was a woman remembering the life that could have been. The door opened and her daughter Angela stepped inside, her hospital scrubs slightly wrinkled from a long shift. "You went viral today," Angela said, with a wry smile, setting down her bag. "Jasmine Patel's mother called me, said you broke the laws of calculus and the laws of social hierarchy in one afternoon." Clara chuckled quietly. "I didn't do it for a show." Angela pulled up a chair. "Then why'd you do it?" Clara didn't answer right away. She reached beneath the table, opened the bottom drawer of the sideboard, and pulled out a worn, battered cardboard box. Inside were old notebooks, their pages yellowed, the edges curled. Angela leaned forward, confused. Clara placed one in front of her and opened it. Page after page, equations, theories, graphs, scribbled notes, midnight, thoughts in mathematical form. Some pages dated back 25, even 30 years. The handwriting never wavered. "I never stopped," Clara said softly. "Not once," Angela blinked. "You've been doing math all this time. You never told me." Clara traced her fingers along the page. "When I left Princeton, I thought it was temporary. I thought I'd go back after things got better. But life doesn't always wait for better. It just keeps moving." Angela looked at her mother, eyes wide with realization. "You never stopped being a mathematician." Clara exhaled. "No, I just stopped being seen as one." Long before the Rosewood janitor's uniform, Clara Daniels had stood in lecture halls where people refused to look her in the eye. She had entered Princeton at 19, a full scholarship student from a poor Charleston neighborhood, and by the end of her first semester, she had stunned every professor she met. But genius, she quickly learned, had a price, especially when it didn't come in the expected package. She had the numbers, the theories, the answers, but she didn't have the pedigree, the name, the skin tone, the family donations etched into campus buildings. When she raised her hand, professors ignored her. When she submitted papers, classmates whispered about how someone like her must be copying. When she walked across the quad, she passed girls in pearls who turned their heads and laughed without even pretending it wasn't about her. And then came the messages. Handwritten cruel, slid under her dorm door, or scribbled on the whiteboard outside her room. "You don't belong here. Go back to where you came from. You'll never be one of us." She told no one. Not the faculty, not the administration, not even her mother. Because Clara had always been taught to carry pain quietly, to protect her dream from the kind of noise that could shatter it. But the final blow came not from a student, but from life itself. Her father's accident was sudden, a fall on the docks, a spinal injury, no workers' comp, no health insurance, just bills, stacks of them. Her mother, already working nights, couldn't carry the weight alone. Her younger siblings needed food, clothes, school fees. Clara was thousands of miles away when she got the call, and within a week she packed up everything she had built and took a one-way train back to Charleston. The day she left Princeton, she stood at the gates of the university for a long time, her hands wrapped tightly around her suitcase handle. She didn't cry in public. She waited until the train pulled away and the station blurred behind her. That's when the tears came. She had made a promise to herself that day. One day I'll go back to that world. One day I'll pick up where I left off. But days became years. Years became decades. And Princeton faded. Instead, Clara became a series of other things: a waitress, a housekeeper, a grocery clerk, a cleaning contractor, and then finally, a janitor at Rosewood Academy. The pay was steady, the benefits are stable, and in the quiet of early mornings and late nights, she found pockets of time to do the one thing that still gave her joy. She wrote math. She would pick up discarded textbooks from classrooms, solve old problems on the back of receipts, sketch theories in the margins of supply checklists. Her mind never slowed. She just stopped sharing it with the world. Sometimes, while scrubbing chalk dust from Mr. Burke's classroom, she would glance at the problems left on the board. Most of the time, she solved them in her head. Sometimes she whispered the answers to herself under her breath, but she never said them aloud. Not until the day he called her out. And when he did, when that moment came, she didn't walk to the board out of defiance, or ego, or revenge. She did it for the girl she had left behind at the train station. She did it for the part of her that was still fighting to be seen. "I'm not angry," Clara told Angela, her voice even. "Not anymore. But I am tired of being quiet, tired of being erased." Angela reached out and took her mother's hand. "You don't have to be quiet anymore." Clara smiled. "Maybe not. But now that people are listening, I have to decide what to say." The next morning, Clara arrived at Rosewood before sunrise, as she always did, but this time something felt different. Her steps were slower. Her eyes lingered longer on the students' posters and artwork. She wasn't invisible anymore. She was uncertain, unsettled, seen near the math wing. She passed Jasmine Patel, who was waiting by the lockers. The girl looked up, a little nervous. "Ms. Daniels," she asked. Clara paused. "I was wondering if you might, if you have time, would you maybe help me with some extra problems I'm trying to study for the regional competition, and the way you solved that equation, I've never seen anyone move like that." Clara blinked. It was the first time a student had asked for her help with anything other than a spill or a stain. "I'd be honored," she said. That night, Clara dug through the box of notebooks again. She pulled out one of the more recent ones. Blank pages still waiting to be filled. She ran her fingers across the cover, opened it, and began writing. At the top, in neat cursive, she wrote a title: "What They Never Taught Us: Lessons in Silence, Power and Math." She didn't know yet if it was a book, a speech, a curriculum. She just knew this. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't going to be quiet anymore, and the world would finally hear the voice of the woman behind the broom. For most people at Rosewood Academy, the memory of that Friday when Clara Daniels stepped in front of Mr. Burke's blackboard and cracked open a calculus problem like it was a riddle she'd written herself lingered like a ghost in the halls. Days passed, but the echoes of chalk scratching out a flawless solution still rang in the minds of students and teachers alike, not just because of what had happened, but because of who had done it. Clara had returned to her janitorial duties with the same quiet dignity as before, but the silence around her had transformed. It was no longer born of dismissal, it was born of confusion, awe, even guilt. What no one could fully articulate, but everyone felt, was the fact that something sacred had occurred that day. A veil had been lifted, and for the first time they had glimpsed the brilliance of a woman they had long refused to see. But what followed wasn't a celebration. Not immediately. It was uncertain. It was the school collectively recalculating its identity. Mr. Elijah Burke, once so assured of his position in the intellectual food chain, now found himself haunted by the image of Clara at his board. He couldn't shake it. Her presence had unraveled something tightly wound in him. His image of power, of control, of being untouchable, and though he tried to continue teaching as before, his confidence cracked around the edges. He stood in front of his next class with a forced calm, gesturing toward a new equation. He spoke as if nothing had happened, but he knew the room wasn't listening the way it used to. The students weren't impressed anymore by his clever asides or complex demonstrations. They were remembering how the janitor outmathed the master. And it wasn't just Mr. Burke who changed. Jasmine Patel, who had previously lived for grades and praise, now found herself looking at Clara with wide eyes, not of pity, but of admiration. One afternoon after school, she waited for Clara outside the faculty break room, textbook in hand. "Miss Daniels," she began hesitantly, "I've been working on some independent study material. I want to compete at nationals next semester. But the truth is, I don't understand half of what they teach, the way you understood that equation. Could you maybe show me how you think?" Clara, wiping down a table, looked up. She saw no condescension in Jasmine's eyes, only sincerity. She dried her hands on a towel and nodded. "I'd be honored," she said. It was a small moment, but something larger had begun. The first time Clara returned to room 204, not to clean, but to mentor. She sat beside Jasmine, not at the front. She didn't take over the class. She didn't speak loudly. She simply listened. She asked Jasmine to walk through the problem aloud. When Jasmine got stuck, Clara didn't correct her. She just asked, "Why do you think that's the next step?" It was the way she had taught herself for years in silence, through questioning, through patience, through understanding the logic of the person across from her, not just the numbers on a page. Word spread. Within days, 3 more students approached her, then 7, then 10. They met in empty classrooms during lunch after school before first period. They brought notebooks and calculators, but more than that, they brought their curiosity. Clara never once presented herself as a teacher, but she was becoming the most influential one in the building. What Clara didn't expect, what she couldn't have predicted, was that her quiet guidance would also begin to awaken something in Mr. Burke. It was a Tuesday morning when he caught sight of Clara through the small window of room 203. She was sitting at a desk, surrounded by a group of students speaking softly as they scribbled furiously. Burke watched from the hallway, chest tight. He wasn't jealous. He was ashamed. He had built his identity on the assumption that he knew more, that he saw more clearly than others. But Clara's presence in that classroom made one thing painfully obvious. He had never truly taught, not in the way she was teaching now. He had lectured. Sure, he had impressed, yes, but he had never been inspired. He walked away from the door that morning and for the first time since grad school opened his own textbook again. That night, he spent hours rereading old theories, not to prepare for a lesson, but to remember why he had loved math to begin with. It had been so long since it was about wonder, it had become about ego. The next day, Burke approached Clara in the hallway. "Daniels," he began, unsure of his voice, "would you consider co-teaching a segment of my class? Real-world applications of multivariable calculus. I think the students would benefit from your perspective." Clara blinked, surprised. "I'm not a teacher." "You are," he said without hesitation. "You just don't stand at the podium, but you've taught them more in a week than I have all year." Clara studied his face, searching for insincerity, but what she saw instead was humility. The walls that had once defined them were crumbling. "I'll think about it," she replied. 2 days later, Clara Daniels stood once again at the front of room 204, but this time it wasn't by accident or invitation through mockery. It was a shared decision. She stood beside Mr. Burke, and together they introduced a lesson on calculus used in environmental modeling, something Clara had quietly studied for years through articles, reports, and her own handwritten problems. But she didn't lecture. She asked. She told the students to imagine a community where flooding was becoming more common. How would they calculate the rate at which water would rise in a basin based on rainfall, urban infrastructure, and population growth? She walked them through differential equations, not with intimidation but with purpose. The students learned they weren't learning a subject. They were learning a language. And for Burke, something cracked open too. Later that week, he removed a framed certificate from his wall, one that had hung behind his desk for years. It was a symbol of his academic pride. Instead, he placed on that wall a photo someone had printed of Clara at the chalkboard. That infamous Friday below it, he wrote in his own handwriting, "Real learning humbles us." The atmosphere at Rosewood began to shift. Students who had once measured their worth by GPA and Ivy acceptances started asking different questions. Not just what can I achieve, but what do I know and how can I use it to lift others? The Daniel sessions became so popular that the school had to assign a dedicated classroom. Some teachers raised eyebrows, others stepped forward to help. One by one, Clara was pulling people into orbit, not through charisma or command, but through the undeniable gravity of integrity. Principal Mariana Torres took notice. At a faculty meeting, she addressed the staff. "We talk about innovation," she said, "about excellence. And yet the most revolutionary thing happening at Rosewood right now is not coming from a textbook. It's coming from the courage of someone we've ignored for years. Clara Daniels is not just reshaping minds, she's reshaping this institution." Burke, seated in the front row, nodded. That afternoon, he drafted an email to the district, a proposal for a new elective course, Mathematics and Social Systems Equity Through Numbers. In the proposal, he listed Clara as co-developer. But perhaps the most profound change wasn't institutional, it was personal. One evening, Clara walked past the courtyard and saw a group of students sitting in a circle, not on their phones, but debating an ethical dilemma using statistical models. Jasmine had her hand raised, talking about access to clean water and income brackets. Another boy was explaining predictive analysis based on zip code inequality. None of this was on the curriculum. All of it had been seeded by her. As she stood there, she felt something she hadn't felt since Princeton Impact. And for the first time in a very long time, Clara Daniels allowed herself a quiet private smile. Not the kind that came from solving equations, but the kind that came from becoming the answer to a problem she didn't even know she was solving. Later that night, she returned home and opened her newest notebook. The first page had been blank for weeks. Now, in clean, elegant handwriting, she began to write. "Awakening is not sudden. It is slow. It is the sound of chalk on board, the lift of a student's eyes, the silence that listens, the space between knowing and being seen. I am not who they thought I was. I am not who I feared I had lost. I am returning." She closed the notebook. Tomorrow she would return to Rosewood. She would mop the floors, wipe the glass, erase the remnants of the day. But she would also stand beside students. She would continue building something far greater than a moment. She was laying down a foundation for transformation, and this time, no one would erase her name from the equation. Change, when it comes to places like Rosewood Academy, rarely arrives with fireworks. It doesn't crash through doors or roar across morning announcements. It moves silently like wind through leaves or thoughts in the stillness between words. And yet, in the weeks following Clara Daniels' return to the front of the classroom, something unmistakable began to move through the school. Quiet at first, then visible, then undeniable. It began with the students, not in the way change usually begins in schools, with rebellion or confrontation, but in reflection. Clara's presence among them had done more than disrupt their assumptions. It had forced them to confront the boundaries of their own imagination. The calculus problem she had solved that day was no longer just a math question. It had become a symbol, etched into memory, replayed in whispers, quoted in text threads. A week after her first session mentoring Jasmine Patel, a sophomore named Elijah Wong scribbled a note on a bathroom mirror in dry erase marker. "What else are we not seeing?" By lunch, the quote had been copied onto whiteboards in 4 different classrooms. It became a question students began asking in subtle, serious ways, not only about the people around them, but about themselves. One girl, Olivia Reyes, had always believed she wasn't math-minded. She came from a family of artists, spoke 3 languages, and had once been told by a former teacher that she lacked the linear thinking required for advanced calculus. But after witnessing Clara walk through her process with a kind of intuitive grace, like someone composing a melody rather than solving a rigid equation, Olivia approached her after school with her notebook in hand. "I don't know if I'll ever be great at this," she said quietly, "but I want to understand it the way you do. I want to feel it." Clara didn't promise she would make her a mathematician, but she did promise to walk beside her. "Math isn't a gate to keep people out," she said. "It's a door, and it swings both ways." Soon the room where Clara met with students, originally an empty classroom in the East Wing, was too full to hold them all. Desks were rearranged. Teachers offered to loan out their rooms. Even the library cleared a section of its media room to create space for students who wanted to work with her. They weren't just asking for help with homework. They were asking how to think differently. And still, Clara never raised her voice. She never asked for recognition. She never once claimed authority. Instead, she cultivated curiosity. She nourished confidence in students who had been told in subtle and not so subtle ways that brilliance had a look, a shape, a pedigree. Her lessons often began not with formulas, but with stories. Stories of resilience, of failure, of growth. She taught them that mistakes weren't the end of a path. They were often the beginning of understanding. Outside the classroom, word began to spread beyond Rosewood's walls. It started with the parents. Jasmine's mother told the story to a friend at a local fundraiser. That friend repeated it at a Charleston City Council meeting. From there, it made its way to a local education blog. And within days, Clara Daniels, the janitor who solved an unsolvable equation, became a name whispered across dinner tables and office water coolers alike. But while Clara was becoming an unintentional legend, something more important was happening inside the school itself. Principal Mariana Torres had always prided herself on progressive values. As the first woman of color to lead Rosewood in its 100-year history, she understood the burden of being seen through a lens narrower than the truth. But Clara's story forced her to look inward, not just at the institution she oversaw, but at her own leadership. How had she failed to see the brilliance of someone right beneath her roof? What kind of system was she presiding over if a woman like Clara had to wait decades to be heard? Torres requested a meeting. They sat together in her office one quiet afternoon. The windows were open, letting in the breeze, and Clara still wore her work uniform. She hadn't come to talk policy. She hadn't asked for an audience. But when Principal Torres offered her a seat, she took it. "I need to apologize," Torres began. "Not because I said something wrong, but because I didn't say anything at all. I walked past you for years and never thought to ask about your story." Clara didn't respond right away. She looked out the window at the trees swaying gently. Then she said, "Most people think silence is neutral, but sometimes it's the loudest thing in the room." Torres nodded, her throat tightening. "We want to do better, not just because of you, but because you've shown us who we could be." From that conversation came the idea of formalizing what had begun with a whisper, a new program built around mentorship, interdisciplinary learning, and access. They called it the Daniels Project, not because Clara asked them to, but because the students insisted on it. It launched as a pilot within 3 weeks. The mission was simple: pair students who had previously struggled with traditional academic systems with mentors who could guide them using more human-centered models of learning. Clara helped develop the framework. She refused the offer to lead it officially. "Let the students lead," she said. But she met with the mentors weekly, reviewed curriculum materials, and offered wisdom in the moments between tasks. The Daniels Project expanded faster than anyone expected. Teachers from other departments began dropping in. English, teachers brought in poetry about identity and silence. History teachers connected mathematical inequality with systemic injustice. Science classes reframed equations as tools for climate justice. The boundaries of subjects blurred. The boundaries between students blurred too. One day, Mr. Burke walked into his classroom and saw two students, one from his honors class, one from his remedial section, working together on a statistical model. They weren't doing it for credit. They were doing it because they had both attended a Daniel session and left with questions they couldn't shake. Burke stood in the doorway for a long time. He didn't speak. He just watched. And then he smiled quietly. The way a man smiles when he finally understands his role has shifted from authority to ally. Even Burke himself had begun to change. His lectures became more collaborative. His tone softened. He stopped grading only for precision and began a rewarding process. He wrote a letter to the school board proposing a new elective course, Math and Justice, the hidden stories behind the numbers. In the proposal, he credited Clara directly. This course, he wrote, was inspired by someone whose intelligence forced me to reconsider not only what I teach, but how I see the world. Clara never asked to read the letter, but she heard about it. She heard about everything. In small ways, the school had started to reorient itself around the values she embodied: compassion, inquiry, respect. The students weren't trying to become like Clara. They were trying to become fully themselves. Still, despite the praise, the articles, and the invitations pouring in, Clara remained grounded. She declined interviews. She turned down a feature from a regional news station. She didn't want her story told in sound bites. She didn't want to be the flavor of the month. She just wanted the work to continue. But one invitation she couldn't ignore came not from the media, but from Principal Torres herself. "We're hosting an all-school assembly," she told Clara one morning in the hallway. "We want to have a conversation about identity, brilliance, and belonging. I want you to speak." Clara hesitated. "I'm not a speaker," she said. Torres didn't argue. She simply said, "You're already speaking every day whether you want to or not. People are listening. And some of them, they need you to keep talking." Clara went home that evening and sat with the idea. She thought of Malik, her grandson, who had called the day before just to say, "Grandma, you don't know how many people you're helping." She thought of the girl she used to be, the one who left Princeton with a suitcase and a promise she never believed she'd keep. She looked at her hands, hands that had scrubbed floors, carried boxes, solved equations no one saw, and she realized something. Her silence had protected her for a long time, but maybe it was time to give her voice a chance. The next morning, she returned to Torres with her answer. "I'll do it," she said softly, "but only if I can tell the truth, the whole truth, even the uncomfortable parts." Torres nodded. "That's exactly what we need." The announcement went out a week later. All school assembly, a conversation with Clara Daniels. The buzz that followed was immediate and electric. Students cleared their schedules. Teachers adjusted lesson plans. Parents asked if they could attend. Even alumni reached out hoping for a live stream. Rosewood Academy was about to hear from the woman they had once passed in silence, and this time they were ready to listen. The day of the assembly arrived beneath a soft Charleston sky, the kind of pale blue that hung between seasons. At Rosewood Academy, the courtyard buzzed with energy, not unlike the day of a major football game or commencement. But there were no streamers, no balloons, no trophies, only a sense that something important, something irreversible was about to happen. Inside the auditorium, every seat was filled. Students shifted with anticipation. Teachers stood along the back wall, some holding clipboards they forgot they were carrying. Parents occupied folding chairs near the stage. Alumni tuned in from laptops across the country, drawn back by a name they had only recently learned to revere. Clara Daniels. She stood behind the curtain alone for a moment. She had refused a podium. She didn't want to stand above anyone. She didn't want her words to echo through a microphone or feel inflated by stage lights. She wanted them to be human, honest, direct. She had written and rewritten her speech a dozen times, and then just hours before she had set the papers aside. What she needed to say, she decided didn't belong on a page. It lived in her memory, in her bones, in the decades she had spent being overlooked, only to return to the world not with vengeance, but with clarity. When the stage manager signaled that it was time, Clara stepped out into the warm light of the auditorium. For a moment, she simply stood there. She took in the crowd, students leaning forward, teachers standing still, faces she'd passed in hallways for years, eyes that, until recently, never looked back. And then she began to speak. "My name," she said, "is Clara Daniels. Some of you know me now. Many of you didn't until recently. And for a long time, I believed that was okay. I believed that being unseen meant being safe, that staying quiet meant being wise. That invisibility was a kind of peace." She paused, her gaze sweeping the room. But there's no peace in silence when it's forced. There's no dignity in shrinking yourself so others don't feel small. And there's no wisdom in letting the world decide your value based on your uniform, your skin, your past. There was not a whisper in the auditorium. I came to Rosewood nearly 20 years ago. I scrubbed these floors. I cleaned your classrooms. I carried away the trash no one wanted to think about. And for a while, I thought that was all I was supposed to be. Just hands, not a mind, not a memory, just a body moving through your hallways. A few students shifted uneasily, but no one looked away. I had once been a student too. At Princeton, I had been told I was gifted, exceptional. I believed it for a time. But life had other plans. My father was injured. My family needed me. And so I left. Her voice did not tremble. It carried the weight of someone who had made peace with every loss she had endured. I traded equations for paychecks, not because I lost my love of learning, but because survival became my profession, and even as I mopped chalk dust from your desks, I still solved problems in my mind. I still read theories while you slept. I still filled notebooks with ideas that had nowhere to go. She looked toward a cluster of students in the front row, many of whom had studied with her in quiet rooms long after the school day ended. I didn't stop being a mathematician. I just stopped being believed. A breath seemed to move through the room like wind through a field. Teachers bowed their heads. Students blinked quickly, swallowing what they were feeling. There was something sacred unfolding, something raw and real and unprotected. And then one day, Clara continued. I was handed a piece of chalk, not with honor, but as a joke, a dare, a way to remind me of my place. But what happened next didn't just surprise you. It surprised me. Not because I solved the problem, I always knew I could, but because for the first time in decades, I let myself be seen. Her voice softened. And when I turned back to that room and saw your faces, your disbelief, your awe, I realized something. I realized that our stories don't end just because they take a detour. I realized that being buried doesn't mean being dead, that potential doesn't expire. She stepped away from the center slightly, as if the words needed room to breathe. I didn't do what I did to prove anything to you. I did it to remember myself, to give voice to the woman who had gone quiet so long ago. She looked toward Principal Mariana Torres, who stood near the wings of the stage, tears in her eyes. We talk a lot about excellence in this school, about talent. But what if I had never picked up that chalk? Would you still believe I was worthy? Would you still think I belonged? Her question hung in the air, neither accusation nor plea, but a mirror. What about the students who haven't had their moment yet? The ones who are overlooked because of how they speak or where they come from or how they dress? What brilliance are we losing because we're looking in the wrong direction? There were students now wiping their eyes. Teachers clenched their jaws to keep composure. Clara was not preaching. She was not performing. She was remembering, and in doing so, she was teaching. I stand before you today, not because I want a second chance at Princeton or a classroom of my own. I don't need a title to validate my intelligence. I don't need applause to justify my existence. What I need, what I hope is that you remember this. She took a step closer to the edge of the stage. Look closer at each other, at yourselves. Ask who's missing. Ask whose voice isn't being heard. Ask what assumptions you've made and what truths you've ignored. She inhaled and with her final breath said, and when the moment comes, because it will, when someone you underestimated picks up the chalk, don't laugh, don't look away, don't wait for the world to tell you who they are. See them now fully. She bowed her head quietly. The auditorium remained still. For a full 30 seconds there was no movement, just breath, just presence. And then a single student stood, followed by another, and another, until every person in the room was on their feet, not in a rehearsed standing ovation, but in a collective acknowledgement that something sacred had just happened. It wasn't just applause, it was an apology, it was gratitude, it was a promise to do better. That night, as the auditorium emptied and the sun dipped below the horizon, Clara Daniels returned to her modest apartment. She removed her uniform with care, hung it neatly, and sat by the window with a cup of tea. Across her lap rested a new notebook, its cover smooth, its pages untouched. On the first page she wrote, "The voice I gave away is now mine again, and it will be used wisely, gently, fiercely." In the weeks that followed, the Daniels Project grew into a cornerstone of Rosewood's new culture. Clara continued mentoring, not for fame, but for joy. Mr. Burke restructured his curriculum, incorporating real-world contexts that demanded empathy as much as logic. Students took initiative to form community partnerships, bringing math education into underserved neighborhoods, guided by the principles Clara had taught them, that everyone, regardless of background, holds value and brilliance often blooms in silence. Clara's story traveled further than she ever intended. Universities requested her as a guest speaker. The mayor of Charleston asked her to consult on citywide education initiatives. She declined most offers, choosing to stay close to the students who needed her most. But she did accept one invitation, a return to Princeton. She walked those halls again, not as a student filled with fear, but as a woman who had rebuilt her identity from the ground up. She spoke in the very lecture hall she had once sat in, and when she finished the standing ovation came not from astonishment, but from recognition. She was never invisible again, and yet Clara Daniels never let her story become about her alone. She reminded people again and again, this wasn't about one woman solving one problem. It was about the millions of quiet stories waiting to be heard, the minds behind the mops, the voices behind the silence, the equations hidden in hearts that had never been asked to speak. Her legacy was not a moment, it was a movement, and it continues every time someone picks up a piece of chalk and refuses to let the world define what they're worth. When we look back at the story of Clara Daniels, what we find is not simply a tale of unexpected brilliance or the poetic justice of an underestimated woman rising to undeniable power. It is at its core a story about identity, resilience, and the devastating cost of being unseen in a world that too often equates value with visibility. Clara Daniels' journey began in silence, not the peaceful kind, but the silencing kind. The silence of exclusion, of being overlooked, of being assigned a role and expected to remain there indefinitely. She didn't walk into Rosewood Academy hoping for recognition. She didn't arrive asking for second chances or acknowledgement. She came to do her job, to provide for her family, to survive. And yet beneath that quiet presence lay a mind of staggering ability, trained in one of the most prestigious institutions in the country, shaped by hardship and sharpened by years of self-study and spiritual discipline. But no one asked. No one noticed. The tragedy wasn't just that Clara's talent went unseen, it was that people believed it couldn't possibly exist in someone like her. And that is where the deeper truth of this story lives in our collective blindness, in our willingness to reduce people to titles, uniforms, and appearances. Clara wasn't merely a janitor, she was a mathematician, an educator, a philosopher, a mother, a woman with a complex past and a blazing mind. And it took one cruel joke, a piece of chalk extended with mockery, for the world to realize that what they had dismissed was in fact a treasure. But Clara's story didn't end with that moment at the chalkboard. If it had, it might have been just another viral anecdote, a brief flash of vindication in an otherwise bleak landscape. What followed is what made her story unforgettable. She didn't bask in applause or seek to climb any ladders. She used her rediscovered voice to teach, to uplift, and to transform. Her humility remained intact, but it was no longer paired with invisibility. She guided students not with ego, but with empathy. She taught calculus with the tenderness of someone who knew what it was like to be told she didn't belong. She offered her knowledge not as a currency to be hoarded, but as a bridge to those who needed it most. Her presence awakened something in Rosewood Academy, a place built on exclusivity and tradition. For the first time, the school saw itself honestly. It saw its silences, its blind spots, its quiet complicity in maintaining a hierarchy of value based not on merit but on assumption. Principal Torres recognized it. Mr. Burke confronted it. Students one by one began to challenge what they thought they knew about who deserves to lead, to teach to be heard. And Clara, with her calm strength and unshakable dignity, became the center of a storm. She never asked to start. What made Clara exceptional was not just her intellect but her unwavering sense of self. Even when the world denied her a platform, she kept writing in notebooks. Even when the academic doors closed, she opened her mind in secret. She never needed permission to be brilliant. She only needed the space to be heard. In the end, she returned to the world not as a forgotten talent resurrected, but as a fully formed truth that had always existed, just waiting for someone to ask the right question. When she finally stood before the entire school to tell her story, she did not seek applause. She offered a challenge to see one another, to listen more carefully, to question our own biases, to stop waiting for people to prove themselves worthy of our respect, and to start offering that respect as a starting point, not a prize. She didn't demand change, she inspired it. And what followed was more than reform. It was redemption, not just for Clara, but for a school that had to reckon with its own complicity. In the wake of her truth, doors opened. Programs expanded. Conversations deepened. The Daniels Project became a model for inclusive education across the state. Teachers revised their syllabi. Students reached beyond their cliques. The boundaries of who could belong, who could lead, and who could shine began to dissolve. But even as her influence rippled outward, Clara never stopped doing what she had always done. She walked the halls, she showed up early, she listened more than she spoke, and she made space over and over for others to step into their own voices. Her story is a reminder that justice doesn't always come from courtrooms or rallies. Sometimes it comes from picking up a piece of chalk in silence and rewriting the way the world works. The lesson. So what do we learn from Clara Daniels? We learn that potential can survive decades of silence. We learn that brilliance wears many faces and speaks in many voices, not all of them loud. We learn that a person's value cannot be measured by titles, salaries, or the polish of their shoes, but by the weight of their integrity and the power of their persistence. We also learn how easy it is to overlook someone, to walk past genius because it doesn't wear the right badge, to ignore wisdom because it comes from a mop rather than a microphone. Clara's story is not an exception, it's a revelation. How many more Claras are among us right now, working quietly, enduring invisibility, waiting not for applause but for opportunity. How many voices have we missed because we assumed they had nothing to say? Clara teaches us to pause, to ask, to listen, to stay open to the possibility that someone we've dismissed may just be holding the answer to a problem we haven't yet learned how to solve. Applying the lesson to our lives. So how can you bring this into your own life? Start by looking around you with new eyes. That barista you see every morning, the custodian who empties your trash, the quiet coworker in the corner who rarely speaks up. What questions haven't you asked? What stories haven't you heard? Be curious, be kind, be open. Don't wait for someone to prove they matter before you treat them like they do. In your workplace, mentor someone who's often overlooked. In your community support programs that elevate underrepresented voices. In your conversations, resist the urge to dominate. Listen instead. And in your heart, remind yourself daily, no act of dignity is ever wasted. No voice raised for justice is ever too small. Clara Daniels didn't ask to be a hero, but she became one. And if you truly listen to her story, you might become one too. Question time. Which of the following best represents the core message of Clara Daniels' story? A. Intelligence must always be proven through public recognition. B. True brilliance can exist in silence and still change the world. Drop your answer, A or B, in the comments below and tell us why. Let's see who truly understood the heart of Clara's journey. Now we want to hear from you. What about you? Have you ever felt underestimated, overlooked? Do you know someone whose potential has been hidden behind a label, a job title, or a stereotype? Share your story in the comments. We believe in building a community where voices, like Clara's, aren't the exception. They're the foundation. Let's inspire one another. Let's lift up the stories that too often go untold. If this story moved you, if it stirred something deep within your soul, please subscribe to our channel. Your support gives us the strength to keep creating stories that matter, stories that heal, stories that reveal. And if you're able, consider making a small donation to help us continue this work. Creating high-quality, meaningful content takes time, heart, and resources, especially in the early stages. Every dollar you give helps bring one more hidden voice into the light. Together, let's continue building a platform where stories like Clara Daniels aren't rare, they're respected. Thank you for listening, for feeling, for believing. We'll see you in the next video, and until then, never underestimate the power of the quietest voice in the room, because sometimes it's the one that changes everything.